Let's talk about climate models. Climate models are used to predict the climate of the future, say 100 years or 200 years ahead. How do these climate models work? How do you develop a climate model? Let's have a look at the global climate system first. Okay, it's a little sketch shown here and showing the key features, key processes. Okay, so you now can imagine that you're in a computer model. You have different components. So what you do first is you define your components and you work out what you need to do for each component. What I mean is, for example, for the atmosphere, you need to be able to predict the wind patterns and the circulation in the atmosphere. So that's the basis of what happens in the atmosphere. You need to get the intertropical convergence zone. You need to get the Hadley cell and stuff like that. Okay, and then what also, if you look at the atmosphere, you need to include greenhouse gases and describe the greenhouse effect. Indeed, you need to get all the radiation into these models. You know, all the radiation, the surface fluxes and stuff that we discussed before. All the greenhouse gases, you know, aerosols and stuff like that. You know, and then you need to be able to predict cloud formation. Okay, cloud formation. And I'm talking about the water cycle. Okay, we're starting with evaporation, precipitation. You have to get that cycle in. You have to need to be to simulate the interaction with the land surface. Okay, we're talking about vegetation. Okay, volcanic activity. You know, interactions with the biosphere, with the ice sheets. Okay, land surface. You know, indeed, river runoff, stuff like that. You need to be able to represent the ocean in your climate model, including the formation of sea ice and the heat exchange, and also some special features like the circulation patterns in the ocean. Okay, changes in the ocean, circulation, sea level, biogeochemistry. So we're talking about prognostic models. This is about the prediction into the future. That's what we call prognostic, based on an initial conditions and a boundary condition. Okay, certain boundary conditions. Initial conditions, what I mean is, you have to start the model at a certain point in time, and you need to tell the model what are the values for temperatures throughout your model domain. Okay, what are the values for water vapor? What are the values? Anything that you use, actually, you have to initialize. You have to give initial values. Okay, you have to tell what is the wind speed, stuff like that. Okay, and boundary conditions refer to boundaries. Essentially, in this model, you have the land surface. At specific locations, you have greenhouse gas emissions, and you have to tell the model what is this greenhouse gas emission, what is the related flux, and how does it change. Okay. So what do you now do with these individual compartments? And I'll just show you one example for the atmosphere, including the land surface. So what you do is you actually split up your atmosphere into something we call three-dimensional grid boxes. Okay, they're all stacked on top of each other, and you have a grid box corresponding to a certain location and a certain height range in the atmosphere. And each grid box actually represents an average value like temperature, you know, or other parameters. Okay, and then you have all your grid boxes. You cover the surface of the Earth. Okay, and you work out changes within each box. Okay, changes in atmospheric parameters in each box, and you can pass information from one box to the next according to physical laws. Okay. So what are these physical laws? Physical laws are physical principles. Like the conservation of momentum is one, conservation of energy, conservation of mass, conservation of water, okay, the total amount of water, mass contained in the air, and an equation of state. Conservation of momentum is based on Newton's laws of motion. Okay, and what you can actually do is you can predict changes in something we call the velocity. Velocity is the wind velocity, which has components as horizontal winds and a vertical component. And on the very left side of this equation, you can see that there is something like a lowercase t in here. And this one actually is the rate of change of the velocity component. Okay, you can use this to predict the wind velocity. How will it change as a function of time, given everything else in this equation? Okay, so this one, assume that you know all the other terms, and you can calculate it, and then you can calculate the change. This is what we call prognostic. Conservation of energy for the atmosphere is we're talking about temperature changes. Okay, temperature as a measure of the internal energy of the system. And you can see again there is a change of temperature with time. This is the key here. You can predict into the future if you know all the other parts in this equation. Okay? Conservation of mass is simpler. It tells you how the density changes as a function of other processes. Okay. Equation of state links temperature and density and pressure. All right, so these are equations, and this is sort of the core of the atmospheric model. This is the core. Here you can predict the circulations. Okay, and this you can link this to the formation of clouds. You can link this, or this is all driven by surface heat fluxes, stuff like that. These equations are coupled. They are interlinked. Coupled means you can't just run them alone because they contain information that is predicted by one of the other equations here. These are all coupled. There is no analytical solution, so you have to use a computer code to approximate the solutions of these equations. Okay? All right, so that's sort of, I hope that this becomes clear. And just look at this surface, how the surface looks like. The surface is represented as grid cells, two-dimensional grid cells. And for that, you can imagine that some are wet grid cells, which means you have ocean or you have a lake, or some are dry, you have a land surface. Okay. And you can specify what type of vegetation you have for each of these grid cells, or whether you have ice coverage on the grid cell or not. Okay, so this is how the world is treated in a climate model. Okay, I think that's the key parts that I wanted to highlight, and which is sort of shown here again on this slide. It shows you again that you have these grid boxes. Let's activate the mouse. Here we are. You have these grid boxes, and then you calculate the transfer of a property between this grid box and neighboring grid boxes. So you have one grid box to the east, one to the west, one to the north, one to the south, one above and one below. And then you have to work out temperature changes based on the fluxes. Changes on CO2, based on fluxes and or other mechanism. Dust, water vapor. Okay. You have a radiation model in here. Okay. All right. Okay, so that's how it looks like. Okay. All right. So just one key, what's really key here is that these models are also used to actually interpolate. Models are used to interpolate because you don't have observations everywhere, but if you have observations on some spots, you can get the model prediction gives you an interpolation between areas where you have observations. All right, you can also use models to play around. You can do tests. You can say, okay, what happens if I keep CO2 at the same level, no further increase? And that's one of the strengths of these models, is that you can play around. You can say, okay, what happens if I didn't have any clouds? What happens if, the surface vegetation was different? Okay, so just summary, ocean and atmosphere, they are represented by three-dimensional grid boxes, the land surface by two-dimensional grid cells. Processes smaller than the grid resolution cannot be simulated and must be parameterized. Anything smaller than this grid cell, you can't predict it. Okay. A finer grid resolution implies a longer simulation time and the need to use supercomputer. What I mean is, you need to do calculations for each of these boxes, okay, and you need to do calculations in a repeated manner, okay? It's an iteration and repeat, and the more cells you have, the longer it takes. Okay? So we need supercomputers in order to run these climate models, okay? Because it's repeated calculations over and over and over again. All right. So, another similar graph shown here. It's nothing new. It's just a little summary. Prognostic computer models. You split up the climate system into different compartments, different components. We have the ocean, we have the land, and we have the atmosphere. Okay, within each component, we have certain processes that need to be parameterized. You can see here a link to cloud parameterization or turbulence. Turbulence is actually mixing processes that are just, not resolved. That's what we call turbulence. Okay, it's similar in the ocean. You have turbulence parameterizations. You have equations that predict you changes in temperature or changes in the motions. In the currents, changes in the salinity. You have sea ice in there, and then you have land. Have vegetation, land zone. Okay. All right, and they're coupled through fluxes, essentially. And this just shows a few here: sensible heat, evaporation, precipitation, radiation stuff. Surface heat flux. We talked about that. Wind stress. All right. So let's just talk a little bit more about parameterization. It's a simplified description of a process that cannot be resolved within the model. So what do we mean by that? Or which processes? In the atmospheric model, we can't resolve tropical convection and cloud formation. So we have to make assumptions as to when and how much clouds form under certain conditions. Okay? And these assumptions are based on observations. Okay? They are based on observed evidence. They are not made up. They are based on evidence. But it doesn't mean that every model uses the same assumption. There are several suggestions, and some models use one particular parameterization, and another model uses a different parameterization. Okay, the turbulence needs to be resolved. Any process which has, which is smaller than the spacing of these boxes. Surface friction drag. Many details in the vegetation module have to be parameterized. Interactions with vegetation is a very, cannot be resolved. The ocean model, we have turbulence including eddies, has to be resolved. Friction, waves are not represented. So I'm talking about surface gravity waves, and some other important processes like we call it dense water cascading, which means it's heavy water which sinks or flows downward on continental slopes into the deep ocean. Formation of Antarctic bottom water is not resolved, needs to be parameterized. Ice models have lots of parameterization concerning the sea ice formation, the types of ice that are formed, and stuff like that. Okay. Ice also contain cracks, so-called leads, and you have to know within one grid cell how many cracks do you have and what is the average extent of sea ice within one grid cell. So many details need to be parameterized in these models. So let's talk a little bit about the history of climate models, starting from the mid-1970s with the development of computers. Okay, in the mid-1970s, the resolution was very coarse. Okay, we're talking about a resolution of 500 kilometers as the length of the side length of one of these grid boxes. Okay, going back to very, very coarse resolutions, and not even the ocean was included in these. Mid 1970s, mid 1980s, mid 90s, and so you had a little bit of call it a swamp ocean, essentially just the surface of the ocean. There was a little bit of heat changes in here in the ocean. Okay? And that all developed now with the availability of better computers, faster and more storage. The ocean actually was only included more accurately since 1996. Okay? The resolution halved to the grid spacing halved to 250 kilometers here. And then more and more chemistry was involved, and so only since maybe the early 2000s we actually have most processes actually represented in the climate model. Okay? Including interactive vegetation, so the vegetation can interact with predicted temperature changes, for example. Okay? Carbon cycle, we have a carbon cycle fully included. Stuff like that since 2001. And that's all to do with the digital revolution. Ironically, the data storage centers are actually responsible for 2% of the global carbon emissions. Okay, we need more and more computer power, and that's indeed not all used for climate models, but ironically, it's also part of the problem, isn't it? Okay? All right. So who develops climate models? Climatology sections of national meteorological services like BOM in Australia, universities worldwide, national and international research labs like the CSIRO in Australia. Okay. The World Climate Research Program, hosted by the World Meteorological Organization, coordinates research activities on climate modeling worldwide. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, coordinates the publication of key scientific findings of climate model predictions. So let's briefly talk about what climate models can do and what they can't do. What they get is they can simulate basic features of the general circulation of the atmosphere, including rainfall patterns associated with it, like the Hadley cell or middle-latitude jets, stuff like that. They can they can reproduce the climatology, seasonal and monthly means of climate variables, like temperature and precipitation. They can predict monsoon cycles and average storm track characteristics. Okay? I'll show you one example here above: observed precipitation and simulated precipitation to give you an idea of, well, it has the key features, but it does not have everything correct. There are differences. If you swap top to bottom, you can see there are differences. Okay? But it's not the aim of a climate model to get everything 100% correct, and technically you can't do it because you are limited by, and I said that before, if you want to do a prediction of 100 or 200 years within a reasonable time frame, you have to use a coarse grid. You have to use coarse grid resolution, and so otherwise it would take 200 years to predict 50 years, so that it will not work out. So what climate models can't predict is the actual weather for specific individual locations at specific times, or the actual seasonal means for a particular regions for a particular year. And why is because climate models don't get interannual climate variability right. And these models they have, and I forgot to mention that, they have, they predict something like an El Nino, okay, or they simulate something like an El Nino, but the intensity might be different and the timing might be totally different compared to the real world. Okay? All right. Good. So let's talk about model validation and ensemble model predictions. So you put your climate model together, and now how do you test it? That's what we call model validation. So once a climate model is set up, it can be tested via a process known as hindcasting. And hindcasting is the opposite to forecasting. Not predicting into the future. Hindcasting is reproducing the past. Okay? So this process compares the model predictions of past climate variations with observed climate and weather conditions to see how well they match. Okay. And we don't only run one model, we do something which is called ensemble model predictions. So you use many climate models, okay, and run them all together. So a model may perform well for some region, a season or a variable, and worse for another, while another model performs well for yet another region, season, or variable. So what we do is we actually take all the model predictions that we have of different models, we put them all together, and we use a method called ensemble modeling, which is shown here in this sketch. So it shows all individual model predictions, all these blue curves, and we calculate the average, which is called the ensemble average. Okay. And we can also work out what is the projection uncertainty. So you have, in this case, it's temperature. You have an upper bound of temperature predicted and a lower bound. Okay, we can express this as a projection uncertainty. And there's more complexity because we also have, and this is shown here above my head, we also have an initial condition uncertainty. So how good are the initial conditions? Initial conditions of, you have to use models have to use similar initial conditions, and you have to analyze the initial conditions. And we also have a forecast uncertainty then. based on the initial condition uncertainty. Okay. All right, so that's a little bit how complex that is, and I want you to show you one example. And in order to show you that example, I want you to introduce you to the Coupled Model Intercomparison Project, CMIP. Okay, and it has many partners worldwide, and this just shows you the list of organizations and countries that are currently directly or indirectly involved, goes all around the world. And it's an intercomparison project. It looks at different climate models, and it now targets specific intercomparisons. So let me just tell you, this project was established in 1995. And the third phase of this project was undertaken for the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change for a specific report, the fourth assessment report in 2007. And it's about interpreting the results of climate models. Okay. The phase 5, which started in 2008, defined a set of 35 climate model experiments to assess the model weaknesses and differences. Okay. Specifically designed to improve the models and to point out what are the differences. The latest phase, which is called phase 6, which started in 2013, again looks at endorsed intercomparison projects. What's meant by that is a focus. So this is a project, this entire thing focuses on specific aspects. And this is shown here in this little sketch. It talks about systematic biases or variability, predictability, future scenarios, or response to forcing. Okay, and then there's a specific focus on aerosols, for example. So one intercomparison project only focuses on aerosols, how it is parameterized, different models, what the model differences are. That's the specific focus. Another one focuses exclusively on the carbon cycle or the land use there's a part. One talks about geoengineering. One is about decadal prediction. How good is that in models? Different scenarios, impacts, ice, ocean, land interface, clouds. Okay, so these ones are intensive scientific-based projects that aim at improving climate predictions. And I'll show you one example. That's the only reason why I introduce you to that. I want to show you one example on the next slide, which are ensemble model predictions as a hindcast of dozens of climate models. Okay, so here are a list of climate models used. And these are all endorsed climate models. There's a process. So if you run or develop a climate model, you have to apply, and it can become an endorsed climate model. And all these different climate models were used here for this to predict global average temperature expressed as an anomaly from 1850 to 2014. Okay, so you can see all these models, including ranges. Okay, you can see some are not lines; they give ranges, and they give ranges because you might get different results for different initial conditions or for using different parameterizations. You get a whole range of predictions, and you get an upper range and a lower range. Okay. All right, and then you can calculate the average of all your predictions. Okay, and the red curve are the average of the ensemble average. You see the red curve. Okay, and you can follow this, and you can see some features here, and that's what you get. Okay. What's also shown are, okay, so that's the thick red line. So the historical observations, okay, are included as thick black line, dashed black line, and dotted black lines. These are based on observations. And you can see, you can compare now the hindcast of all these climate models with the observations. Okay? And you get relatively good agreement, you know. Okay? But I want to show you that because actually running these models actually leads to scientific progress, because what was observed here is this discrepancy. You can see that the observations in that time, okay, actually were lower than the predictions, okay, starting in particular from something around 2010, okay, it started during that time, okay, and we now know why that is, you know, and it's to do with El Nino events. It's to do with the timing of El Nino events that influences the surface temperature signal. And some models had a wrong timing and some had a good timing. And overall, the models failed to actually to predict during that time what happened during this time. Okay, with the observed temperatures. Okay, but that's now sorted out. So you always get from weaknesses or discrepancies, you can improve the models, and that's all the aim. That's the aim of this CMIP initiative. Alrighty, we come to some study questions. What are ensemble climate model predictions? Why do we do that? Okay, why can't we just decide on the best model and just ignore all the other models? Okay. So which processes need to be parameterized in a climate model? What are the key methods used to actually monitor or measure climate parameters? Okay. So why did actually the performance and quality of climate models improve over time? And how are climate models validated? So thanks for watching.